So today we're going to get through 13 and as much as we can on chapter 14. 13, it's talking about the peripheral nervous system. Now, what is involved in the peripheral nervous system? What does that include? Because there was central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. What's the peripheral nervous system? I was going to say anything but the brain and spinal cord. So all the nerves and nerve endings, things like that. So your brain and your spinal cord, that central nervous system, lots of processing, things going to and from to process. The peripheral nervous system, we have to send all this information to the central nervous system. And so we're going to be looking at, this is all about nerves that are going to the spinal cord or to the brain itself. Now, structure of a nerve. It is a cord-like organ. It's round, it's like a big cord. It's a bundle of myelinated and unmyelinated axons that are all enclosed by different types of connective tissue. Now, I think I only have 3 prefixes that reference this slide. Epi, peri, and endo. Here you go. Epi, peri, and endo. They're all on here. Endo means like the most inside. Epi means on the outside, and peri means around. I'm going to start on the outside with my epineurium. Start on the outside, work my way in. So a nerve, this whole thing is a nerve. It's a big cord-like bundle, whole thing. On the outside, so on the surface of this entire nerve, we have the epineurium. So epi is on, it's on the outside of the nerve. Best I can do. Now, this big whole nerve is composed of smaller bundles. Each bundle is called a fascicle. Here's my little fascicle. Each bundle is called a fascicle, and it has its own connective tissue covering called the perineurium. Peri means around, like a perimeter, and so it goes around a fascicle. Now, inside this fascicle, we have axons. Like part of the nerve, the big long end part that comes off the cell body. Yes, they may have myelin, they may not, but each one of these axons, with or without myelin, has its own connective tissue covering called endoneurium. It's on the most inside part of the nerve, so it gets the endo. And I'm like, so the outside part of the nerve, epineurium, perineurium goes around the fascicles, and the endoneurium goes around the axons with or without if they have a myelin sheath or not. That's your basic structure of a nerve. And I'm like, this is an actual picture of one. And I'm like, so the epineurium on the outside, here is a fascicle, so you'd have perineurium around it, and then each one of these is an axon with myelin, and you'd have an endoneurium around each one of those. Just a big picture of it. I didn't know if I wanted a bigger one. There you go, big one. Now, how we classify all of these nerves. Again, just bringing information to or from. One, they're usually classified on where they are taking information to. What direction are they transmitting information? Now, it's usually sensory or motor, or we call them mixed. Now, sensory information, is it going to go to the spinal cord or away from the spinal cord? 2, if you sense information, like I touched something cold or whatever, I'm like, I touched it. That information has to go towards the spinal cord for processing or for the central nervous system. So sensory goes to the spinal cord or the central nervous system. Motor, it leaves it. It's like, oh, I'm touching something cold. I don't like that. And my brain figures it out, and I send information back out to my arm. It's the motor. It's away from the central nervous system. To be like, I shouldn't touch that anymore. Mixed. It has both sensory and motor fibers. There's not as many mixed. That just means they can send information both to the central nervous system and away. So most of them have sensory, it goes to the central nervous system. Most of them have motor, just information leaves the central nervous system, but a few nerves have both. Now, when we're talking the sensory nerves, where does it go when it gets to the central nervous system? It goes to what we call the pre-command level. It's like, where do we send all this sensory information, that we touch something hot, or it's warm out, or it's cold out, or it's windy, or whatever. I'm like, we've got all this sensory information. We're going to send it into the central nervous system, kind of the top level of where we're going to send information to process it to what we're going to do about it is called the pre-command level. I've got a picture where I'm like, the top, there we go, pre-command level. It is the highest level for thought process and thinking about what we should do about all of it. Now, it includes the cerebellum, and it includes the basal nuclei. This is all information. We thought process, we think about what we're going to do about it, and it sends information to various motor pathways. Are we pulling arms away? Are we moving? Are we walking? What are we doing with all of the sensory information? So we send it there, it gets processed, it will send information back out. Now, this is, showing we've got all the sensory information, what should we do with it? The highest level of thinking, yes, is the pre-command level. There is also what's called a projection level. It's just kind of a, it doesn't take as long to get there, and it's our middle level where we can send sensory information. It just goes to the spinal cord, sometimes to the brain for a little bit of thinking. And then it sends information out. And I'm like, and then we have our lowest level. Information goes to the spinal cord, it never goes to the brain. It's just we sent something, went to the spinal cord, and then went right back out. And I'm like, no thought process whatsoever. When information goes in, no thought process whatsoever happens, and we do something about it. We call that a reflex. I'm like, and we'll talk about different types of reflexes today. But I'm like, no thought process happens. Sensory information went in, your body reacted, and I'm like, and we had some type of motor output. It's a reflex. So they're just showing different parts of the brain. Okay. So here we go, reflexes. A reflex, these are inborn or intrinsic, which means you were born knowing how to do these. You didn't have to learn how to do these reflexes. It's a rapid, fast, involuntary, you can't control it, predictable motor response to some type of stimulus. Now, some examples of reflexes are muscles maintaining our posture. You have muscles right now that are monitoring the fact, if you're leaning one way or the other, and they're keeping muscles taut all the time. There's no higher level thinking about it. And I'm like, however, they're voluntary muscles that are keeping you upright right now. And I'm like, without you even thinking about it, those are reflexes, so you don't fall out of your chair. Although no one has yet. No one has. Things that control your visceral activities. These are your internal organs. And I'm like, they're going to happen. We don't need any higher level thought processes. Some reflexes can be modified by learning and conscious effort. An example, driving skills. And I'm like, there are reflexes. If a ball rolls, and I'm like, with the kid following, rolls right in front of your car, what do? You stop. There's not a lot of time that goes between you seeing it and your foot hitting it. It becomes a reflex. And the more you practice, the faster that reflex happens. Now, because I don't know if I'll get to my last slide on aging sex with the nervous system, as you get older, reflexes slow down. Who does this affect then? The elderly, and they're driving. And I'm like, where you are, your reflex, it happens very quickly. You see a ball run, go in front of your car, you can slam on the brake and not hit the kid. And like an elderly person, reflexes take a little bit longer for that foot to hit the brake, and that might be too long. And I'm like, and so it's not like, we try to pick on the elderly in driving. And I'm like, but physically, and I'm like, the reflexes aren't as quick anymore. Now, part of the reflex, there are 5 parts. And I'm like, to a reflex. No, the 5 parts. 5 parts to a reflex. Again, and like we're just going to stay at the spinal cord level. The very first thing we have to do is have a receptor. We have to have something that's sensing information, whether it's your eyes and you see, a ball and a kid go in front of your car. We're going to do a lot of examples if you touch something hot. And I'm like, but you have to have something sensing information. So if I'm touching something hot, you touched your hand on the burner because you didn't know that it was on. And I'm like, that's your first receptor, the sensing that extreme heat. That information has to travel somewhere. So that information has to travel from your fingertips to your spinal cord through a sensory neuron. So it sensed the information and it sends the information to the central nervous system, the spinal cord. The integration center. This is the thought process, although at the spinal cord there's not a lot of higher level thought process. But this is the part where the information goes into the spinal cord and then switches over to the motor control. We're going to do something about it. So it goes to the central nervous system, spinal cord, and then information travels out of the spinal cord through a motor neuron. Motor meaning action. We're going to do something about the fact that you just touched a burning hot oven. The effector is what organ is affected. What's going, which organ is going to do something about it. In our example, it's going to be a muscle fiber that's going to pull your hand away, extremely fast. It may be various gland cells and other parts of our body. But how long does it take for you to touch a hot stove and pull your hand away? Like less than a second. Like that information has to go from fingertips to spinal cord and right back to the muscles on your arm. And I'm like, we don't want higher level thinking whatsoever. You don't want to be like, I guess it's kind of hot. What should I do about it? And I'm like, a lot of these reflex type actions are usually survival types of things, We don't want to jump into a fire because that would hurt us. You may die if you jump into something too hot or, I'm like our fire, so you move away from that sense or that source. This is just kind of showing those 5 steps. Receptors, your skin, that apparently the stimulus is a nail. Sends information, then sensory neuron to the spinal cord. That information has to go from the sensory, what should we do about it? Doesn't take very much higher level thinking at all. And then sent back out through the motor neuron to an effector organ, some skeletal muscle. Now, some spinal reflexes. Again, these are all reflexes. They stay in the spinal cord, nowhere else. Usually these effectors are all skeletal muscle. And we can test our skeletal muscles and how they react to certain reflexes to assess the condition of our nervous system. And I'm like, and we'll go through some of these specific reflexes, but if your reaction, to touching something hot, we know what will happen. We pull our arm away as fast as we can. However, if it's an exaggerated response, or if it's distorted, your hand's like going everywhere, I don't know, and I'm like, or you don't even pull your hand away, there's something happening on your nervous system. There's some type of missing information, I'm like, whether it's damage to the spinal cord, damage to nerves somewhere, there's some type of damage to your nervous system. And I'm like, and we can sense, we can look at certain nerves and your reactions and to know exactly where there's damage to spinal cord. So if people have been in an accident and they suspect that there is damage to your spinal cord somewhere, they're going to be doing all of these different reflexes, looking for different reactions, and they can be like, we can see based on the fact that they can do this reflex, but not this one. We can see that there's damage at this portion of the spinal cord. And I'll show you, I've got a couple little videos too. So some various different types of reflexes, and we'll go through these. And like some of these are opposites of each other. So there's a stretch and tendon reflex, and I'm like, that's happening when we pull a muscle and I'm like, tighten a muscle. There's a flexor and then a crossed-extensor, and opposite reflexes. And then there's some superficial reflexes, one called the plantar, one called the abdominal, and I've got little videos of each of those. I have no idea if my audio works though. Now, the stretch and tendon reflexes. These two are both looking at what's happening to your skeletal muscle. Is the length of the muscle changing, or is the tension that's on the muscle changing? Now, our body, and I'm like, it doesn't want the muscles to get too long, and it doesn't want the muscles to get too tight, too taut. You don't want too much tension on it. And so our body tries to do the opposite. Like, if a muscle starts to get too long, what's it going to want to do? Shorten it. And if the muscle starts to get too tight, like on the tendons, if it starts to pull too tight, what's it going to want to do? It's going to want to loosen it. It's going to want to try to do these opposites. These are reflexes. And I'm like, now, an example of a stretch reflex. How many of you have done this or had this done to you? This is they hit your knee and your foot kicks out. This is a reflex. It's a stretch reflex. When they take the little, I forget the name of it. Little thing? The what? It is like a limb, but it's got a little name. And I'm like, but when they take it and they are touching, here's your patella, here's your patellar ligament, here's your quadricep. When they hit the patellar ligament, it pulls on your quadricep muscles. It lengthens it. Now, if we are lengthening muscle, what does our body want to do? That's the opposite. It wants to shorten it. And so by hitting it, this lengthened, And I'm like, and yes, this lengthening sends information to our spinal cord, and then it sends information back to the muscles of our quadricep to shorten this muscle. Now, when you shorten this muscle, and I'm like, when I'm shortening the quadriceps, and I'm like, when I shorten it, my foot will kick out. If I shorten this, my foot kicks out. That's what happens. Now, because there are muscles on the opposite side, and I'm like, when I shorten the muscles on the top, the opposite muscles will lengthen. And so all of your hamstring muscles will lengthen to allow that to happen as well. And in just that short amount of time, you lengthen this, so you're lengthening this whole muscle. Our body wants to do the opposite. It wants to shorten it, and your foot kicks out. So that's what happens. It's called the stretch reflex, because you stretch the muscle, and our muscle wants to shorten. Now, the tendon reflex has to do with tightening of the muscle. And I'm like, and again, our muscles don't want to be too taut, and I'm like, you could tear something. And so our body wants to make that tightness relax. And so when we start contracting muscles and shortening it and increasing the tension, we want to do the opposite. I'm like, we'll do this one. And I'm like, the example, if, I'm at the gym, I'm not, and I'm like, if I'm at the gym and I want to work out my quadricep muscles, and I'm like, if I'm lifting whatever machines they are that lift the quadricep, and I'm like, I am producing a ton of tension on this tendon. They both start with T. I'm producing a lot of tension on this tendon. Now, if I try lifting too much weight, what could happen to that tendon? It could tear. Body doesn't like that. It tries to stop that from happening. And so if I start tightening this, producing too much tension, that tension on that tendon sends information to the spinal cord, and I'm like, to the spinal cord, and then back to the quadricep, and I'm like, that same muscle to try to lengthen, to release that tension, because I shortened it when I'm increasing my tension. And so it tries to relax that muscle, and because I want to relax this muscle, it will actually tighten this muscle and try to pull it back. So if I'm shortening this muscle too much, and I'm like, I want to be able to pull it back, relax it, and then pull the one underneath. It helps pull the muscle back to where it should be. And so we're just increasing tension by shortening. So we want to do the reverse. We want to lengthen it, which releases that tension on that tendon, and then we contract the bottom. So when we contract the bottom, it pulls back. Instead of doing this, we want to pull backwards. So that's the tendon reflex. Tendon has to do with tension. We want to release the tension. And I'm like, and then the stretch is we want to shorten. Now, the flexor reflex, this is exactly which I'm talking about with touching a hot stove. So you all do this. And I'm like, it's initiated by a painful stimulus. You touched a burning stove. What do you do with your hand when you touch the burning stove? You pull it away. And I'm like, you flex the arm away from that pain stimulus. So it just causes an automatic withdrawal from something that may damage your body. It's a protective instinct. It's a reflex. But my note, the brain can override this. So you can inflict pain on yourself, but not really. And I'm like, you can let pain happen. If you get a finger stick, if you want to donate blood drive in 2 weeks. And I'm like, but if you want to donate blood, and you're like, all right, does it feel good when they prick your finger? No, it's like the most painful part of it. And I'm like, however, although they are pricking your finger, do you let them do it? Yes, you're not pulling away. Your first instance is to pull it away, and I can't tell how many students, because I would prick high school students too. And I'm like, that's their first thing, oh, so bad, so bad. And I'm like, and they don't like it. That's their flexor. I'm like, that instinct is to pull away and not just be like, fine, do it, get it over with. It's just a protective feature that, yes, you can override. The Crossed-Extensor, this happens in weight-bearing limbs. So your legs, but it can also happen in your arms. It consists of a withdrawal reflex and a Crossed-Extensor reflex. So one part of either your leg or your arm is going to flex, and the other leg or arm is going to extend. This happens also usually with some type of pain stimulus, and the stimulated side will pull away. And I'm like, and I've got one example, and I've got another example on the next one. If I step barefoot on glass, because I wasn't paying attention, I was barefoot, and I'm like, what's that foot going to want to do? It's going to want to pull away from the pain. Now, the other leg then now has to support the weight. It will make sure it extends out. And so it's pulling away with one leg, you're flexing, and the other leg will extend out to support the weight. This can happen with your arms too. If someone comes up, and maybe you could, I don't know, practice this at home. Maybe not. If someone comes up behind you and grabs your arm, so I'm like, you could try this. And like they grab your arm. Someone just, comes up and grabs your arm. What's your first instinct to do with that arm? Is to pull away. But you're flexing, you're pulling it into you. Someone grabs your arm and you be like, pull away. Your other arm's instinct will be to go out. And I'm like, whether it's at least down or out. It's almost like, what are you doing? And I'm like, it's a pulling in and extending out. It's a reflex. It's a safety reflex. Is you want to pull away from that stimulus because you're like, oh, what's going on? And I'm like, and your other arm pushes out. So one flexes, one extends out. You could try it. Maybe not freak out someone too much, like a random person. Now, superficial reflexes. These are ones that we can actually see your muscle contract when you touch certain parts of your cutaneous part of the body. What's that? What's the cutaneous part of your body? Is your skin. And I'm like, if we are touching certain parts of the skin, we can actually see different reactions to muscles. One is known as a plantar reflex. The other one's known as an abdominal reflex. Where is the plantar reflex? Where do you think? Where? It's in your foot. And I'm like, I don't remember which one I liked of these. And I'm like, I have two videos. I don't remember which one I liked. I wrote myself a note, the second one. Now, and I'm like, when I do a plantar reflex, I'm looking for a specific reaction when I touch the bottom of a foot. You can try this at home too. And I'm like, when I'm touching the certain part of the bottom of the foot, I'm going to, and you'll see them, they'll take almost like a little paddle. I think you can do it with a thumb. And you just touch the outside, the lateral outside of the bottom of the foot. There is an immediate response, or there should be, when you press down on the outside of a foot. And I'm like, you should have a downward flexion of the toes. And I'm like, so if someone rubs on the outside of the bottom of your foot, your toes should curl in. Should. Now, if you have damage somewhere between your nerves that are coming out of that fourth lumbar vertebrae to the second sacral nerve, that's your L4 to S2, if they don't curve in, a lot of times what they'll do is curve out or fan out. Your toes are normally just straight. They'll fan out. It's called a Babinski's sign. And so your big toe may curl in, but all the other digits fan out. I have no idea if the audio works in here when I've got this thing plugged. We're going to go with no, only because I think it's has to run through my audio thing. That's okay. We're just going to watch his foot. Because I think they do it, well, one of his foot is normal and one is not. So he's explaining he's going to rub the outside of the foot along the outside, and you should see the toes curl in. It's not going to be like a huge curling in. You should be able to see them curl in on the one foot. A little bit. A little bit. And I'm like, are they curling a little bit more? On his other foot, where he actually had damage on one side of his his spinal cord, and I'm like, instead of them curving in a little bit, they'll actually start to separate. A little bit. Not the best. He explains it better when he does it. A little bit. I'm like, not huge. The other type of reflex is an abdominal reflex. Again, we can look for actually your abdominal muscle to contract. And so if you're wanting to know if you have any damage to your spinal cord, anywhere between your thoracic, your 8th thoracic vertebrae to your 12th thoracic vertebrae, and I'm like, you can touch certain parts of your stomach, and again, you can try this at home, and you should be able to see muscles contract. Now again, they're not a huge muscle contraction. It's not like this particular lady is going to like just sit up and do like a full sit-up, but you can see the muscle almost sink in as it contracts. And so yes, it can vary intensity. So it's one of those, I will say, it's not a huge indent. But you will see her muscle almost sink in, like she's just, trying to suck in her stomach. She's not trying to suck in her stomach. So it goes down, and each part that he does is testing a different nerve. And when he rubs it along the skin, her stomach goes down. It's contracting. And it contracts a little bit. And it goes in. It looks like she's almost trying to suck it in. She's not trying to do that, but it immediately contracts. Again, you can try that at home. Those are all superficial. And in theory, you shouldn't have any spinal cord damage that I know of. And you should be able to see your muscles contract as they go in. So, away from reflexes. Now, yes, this kind of whole chapter is talking about nerves, but since all the nerves have to go into the spinal cord, we're talking about spinal cord at this point. So all the nerves have to go in and come out of the spinal cord. So we're going to talk a little bit about the spinal cord. Some of this is review from lab today too. One, it begins at the foramen magnum. What's that? The big hole underneath that occipital bone. And it ends, at the first lumbar vertebrae or the second lumbar vertebrae. Kind of depends on certain people. And that doesn't mean the nerves just up and end right there, but the actual spinal cord ends right there. Now, their function provided two-way communication to and from the brain. Information go into the spinal cord, it can go up to the brain, process, come back down, and then go out wherever it needs to go. However, if you have reflexes that only stay at the spinal cord, we call them spinal reflexes. This is showing the whole spinal cord starts at the occipital foramen and goes down to the lumbar. Then, it starts to kind of branch off with just a whole bunch of nerves. Now, there are two different enlargements where it gets a little bit wider. There's an enlargement where it gets a little wider around the cervical vertebrae up there, and one right around the lumbar. Any guess why it gets a little thicker in those two regions? It might say on the next slide. I don't remember. Maybe, or in an upcoming slide somewhere. Maybe, somewhere, maybe. I was going to say, there you go. I'm you have lots and lots of nerves. And so you have lots of nerves come from this lumbar arrangement, then I go to your legs. It's a lot of part of your body that has to have nerves served going to and from. And you have a whole bunch of nerves coming from that cervical region, that cervical enlargement, that are going to the arms. And and so there's a little bit thicker area right there. Now, yes, there are 31 pairs of nerves that are going to come off the spinal cord. And yes, if you have to take advance, you have to know them. It's not that bad. And they do get enlarged in certain areas at the bottom. So at the bottom, because it only goes to about the first or second lumbar, and then it just starts to branch off. You just have all nerves. They're not bundled all together anymore. You just have lots and lots of nerves. So it ends right here where you're no longer bundled together. You just have lots and lots of nerves coming off the bottom of the spinal cord. That end part, where it all branches just into nerves, is called the cauda equina. Now, any guess what animal equine is talking about? Horse. Any guess what part of the body cauda or caudal is? It's the tail. And cauda equina, it translates to horse tail. Apparently this looks like, a big huge bundle, and it branches off to a horse's tail. And there's just a whole bunch of different nerves at the very end of that spinal cord that are going off to usually some part of your legs. Now that's where we kind of already went over this, that yes, we've got some dark matter, and we've got gray matter, and we've got a front side, and we've got a back side. We didn't talk about the fissures though. I don't think in lab you had to know them either. One, we've got a dorsal side, we have a ventral side. Dorsal, because there's your dorsal root ganglion. And on the dorsal side, and we do have an indent. We also have an indent on the ventral side as well. And the ventral or the anterior indent, we call it as the ventral or anterior median, because it's in the middle, fissure. It's just an indent that helps kind of divide the spinal cord in half. On the back side, we have a dorsal or posterior median sulcus. both look about like the same length. If we had an actual spinal cord, the front side is a little deeper. However, the fissure does not divide it completely in half. It doesn't go all the way to the central canal there. There is still some information, there's still some material right there in the middle. That's called your gray commissure. And I'm like this little middle part that still holds the two halves together. And it is where you find the central canal. So it's not completely divided in half. There's my big, huge, big picture. Now, the gray matter. And I'm like, yes, the gray matter. In lab, you just have to know the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. So if I go back, dorsal horn, ventral horn, certain parts of the spinal cord, depending on where you slice it up in the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, it all looks a little bit different. In some parts of the spinal cord, you get this additional spike to the side. Call it as a lateral horn. The lateral horn is not always there. And I'm like, it just depends on where you slice the spinal cord. Oops. The dorsal roots, I'm going back and forth too many times. Go back. There's your dorsal root, there's your dorsal root ganglion. Now, information goes into the spinal cord through the dorsal side. So dorsal roots are sensory information. So information goes into the back side of the spinal cord and then comes out the front side of the spinal cord. Goes in the back, comes out the front. The reason why you have that dorsal root ganglion, that big bulge on the dorsal root, you have a whole bunch of neurons. So I'm like, here's, your cell body. There's a neuron. And I'm like, you have a whole bunch of these cell bodies all hanging out together. So the axons are all going to be part of the nerve, but all of the cell bodies are hanging out together. That's what makes that big, huge bulge on the dorsal root. Just a bunch of cell bodies all hanging out together. Now, the white matter, and I'm like, some of the white is because of myelin, because myelin is a lighter color. However, there are some non-myelinated parts. They run in 3 directions. All of the white matter surrounding all the horns. These are the columns, the funiculi. One, and I'm like, they can run up. This is usually sensory information. It goes into the spinal cord, runs up the white matter, up to the brain for processing. We can also have white matter, I'm like, that's sending information back down. Okay, we've thought about what we're going to do about it. So we're going to send information back down to the nerve. Travels through the white matter. Or you can have some of the white matter that's just sending information from one side to the other. A lot of these are those middle fibers. And I'm like, right in the middle. Instead of just going up or down, it's just sending information back and forth. Now, yes, we divide them into columns. Funiculi is the official word. Columns is fine. And I'm like, we've got the dorsal side, close to the dorsal root. Dorsal side, we've got the lateral side, and you have the ventral columns. And I'm like, it's just the white matter. Now, each spinal tract, meaning, if I could slice it, better picture. I'm like, here's a nerve, here's 3 different nerves here. Each spinal tract to be a part of the spinal cord that has nerves going in and out. So there's like 3 spinal tracts right here. Each spinal tract has axons that have similar destinations and functions. And I'm like, so the information that's going in and out of this particular spinal tract, this top one, is sending information to and from approximately the same place and controlling approximately the same thing. Now, this is where I was saying your spinal cord does not always look the same. And I'm like, especially with that gray matter. And I'm like, occasionally you have these big lateral horns sticking out, and I'm like, that you don't see elsewhere. So this is what your, kind of the top part of your spinal cord. This is where you're getting a little bit thicker in that lower kind of cervical enlargement. And I'm like, you can see the difference in the gray matter just as you go through different parts of the spinal cord. It's not all, here's exactly what your gray matter looks like. Here's exactly what your white matter looks like. It looks a little different, just depends on what part of the spinal cord. There we go. I already said it before. There are 31 segments, 31 nerves that exit the spinal cord. There they all are, all numbered for like C1, C2, C3, and so forth for the different vertebrae they're next to. Some review before I continue on with, I think, chapter 14. The perineurium, blank. So pull out your colored note cards. What does the perineurium do? Thinking peri. Pink, orange, yellow, or green? It's not pink. Choose another. You find the perineurium, so it's a perimeter around bundles. There you go. Now, those bundles have a name. The fascicles. Fascicles. I'm like, so around each fascicle, I don't know how I want to draw it, but I'm like, here's one fascicle, here's another fascicle, here's our fascicles. And I'm like, all together, they're surrounded by the epineurium. And then endoneuriums are these little tiny ones in the middle. The what portion of the spinal cord controls muscle movement? Thinking of information going in, information coming out. Which one do you think controls muscle movement? It's the ventral. Information goes into the spinal cord on the back side, and it comes out on the front side. So it's in sensory goes in the back, going to do something about it on the front, so the ventral side. I don't think I went over this in detail. You'd have to look it up on the slide. Which pre-command structure, because there was like 2 pre-command structures, if you can narrow it down to 2. The 2 pre-command structures, which one of the 2 inhibits various motor centers of the brain? If you can remember the 2 parts of the pre-command structure, you can narrow it down. You get a 50% chance. And it's not pink. But that was one of the pre-command levels. Which leaves you with, there we go, the basal nuclei. The cerebellum and the basal nuclei are the 2 parts of the pre-command level. The cerebellum really, it's like it controls a lot of motor. It's making your muscles contract and control. Basal nuclei is making it so the muscles don't contract unnecessarily. So it inhibits motor controls, which is why I'm like, Parkinson's disease is actually damage to the basal nuclei. And so since basal nuclei inhibits motor control, like it inhibits muscles from contracting, what's the side effect of Parkinson's? Is that shaking, because that basal nuclei is not inhibiting that muscle contraction anymore. And so the muscles are just kind of contracting out of control. Quickly lifting your foot and leg after stepping on a rock is an example of what? It is the orange. It's an intrinsic reflex you were born knowing how to do. The length of a muscle, because I've just changed the length of a muscle, is communicated to the brain by what? What do you think sends information to the brain that the length of the muscle is changing? Which is the only thing that talks about length, or which is the only thing on here that can change length? It's the muscle spindle. This is the actual internal part of the muscle. And I'm like, we talk more about muscles in our next unit, but it's the muscle spindles, the parts of the muscle themselves are stretching. A tendon reflex involves what happening? Now, when the tendon reflex, a tendon has too much tension on it. So you want to do what the opposite. If you have too much tension on a tendon, they both start with T. Too much tension on a tendon, what do we want to do? Or what will the reflex make it do? It's the orange. It will then make it relax and lengthen because you shortened it to create the tension. Now it's going to relax and lengthen. The crossed-extensor reflex is important when what? This was my example too. You step barefoot on a sharp object. That's when you're going to pull back, pull that one foot back or the one leg back, and then you're going to extend the other leg to support all your weight. Now, chapter 14, our autonomic nervous system. Based on its name, what can you tell me about the autonomic nervous system? It happens automatically. Do you have any control of it? Nope. And I'm like, so this is things that are beyond your control. So the autonomic nervous system, it consists of motor neurons that control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. These are things you have no control over. And it adjusts our body to make sure that we are, have optimal everything. You're not too hot, you're not too cold, you may sweat, you may not. But it's all under subconscious control. You cannot control it. It is occasionally called your involuntary nervous system, because you can't control it. And occasionally, it's pretty rare, I hear it called the general visceral motor system. Not usually called that. Usually autonomic, or occasionally I hear involuntary nervous system. These are all things you have no control over. Back to kind of our divisions, and I'm like, of the nervous system, yes, there was central nervous system. What does the central nervous system consist of? Brain and spinal cord, yep. Then you had the peripheral nervous system, so all the nerves. Information goes in, information comes out, sensory, motor. The motor division has your somatic nervous system and your autonomic nervous system. What's controlled in the somatic? What? It's the start part you do have control over. It's the skeletal muscles. I have control over my skeletal muscles unless it's a random reflex one. And I'm like, but that's the skeletal muscles I have control over. Autonomic, these are all the things you don't have control over it. And yes, it gets further divided out as well. Again, here's kind of my, if you remember, I saw a bear. I sense the information. It gets processed in the central nervous system. It comes out, goes to the motor division. Somatic is your skeletal muscle. You can control that. Your autonomic nervous system are all the parts of the body you have no control over. Now, the somatic versus the autonomic. So the somatic versus the autonomic. One, they both have motor fibers. They're both going to cause something to happen. One's just controlling. I'm like, they differ in their effectors. And I'm like, what is it they're controlling? And I'm like, one's controlling skeletal muscle. That's its effector. And I'm like, the autonomic controls cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So their effector organs are completely different from each other. They differ in the pathways that the information leaves the spinal cord. And we'll get into some of that today. But like they have different pathways out of the central nervous system, out of the spinal cord. And they have different neurotransmitters. They have different chemicals that are sending information. And I'm like, different chemicals, and I was going to say acetylcholine. I'm like, because we get into some of these. And I'm like, acetylcholine makes muscles contract. Norepinephrine makes a lot of your involuntary things contract and do something. So they have different neurotransmitters. Here we go, different effectors. Now, for the autonomic, the things that you cannot control, it did get further divided into your sympathetic and parasympathetic. When does your sympathetic nervous system kick in? When you're under stress. They both start with an S. And so you're going to do something, you're stressed out about something, whether you saw a bear or whatever. And I'm like, it's when it kicks in. Your parasympathetic then is at rest. Most organs, not all, most organs have dual innervation. And I'm like, means there's, they have some sympathetic control, they also have parasympathetic control. And I'm like, example, your heart is dual innervation. And I'm like, that when you are under stress, your sympathetic nervous system tells your heart to do what? To do what? It's going to speed up, and it's going to start to beat really, really fast. Now, if you're at rest, what does the parasympathetic tell your heart to do? Just slow down. And I'm like, so your heart is controlled by both divisions. That's the dual innervation. Most organs have dual innervation. And I'm like, but not all of them. An example is like, it would be a sweat gland. If you're under stress, your sympathetic nervous system would tell your sweat glands to do what? Make sweat. When you're at rest, there's no like opposite of making sweat. It's just nothing. You just don't make any sweat. So there's no like rest parasympathetic, make less sweat. There's just no sweat. And I'm like, so most are dual innervated, but not all. Now, this dynamic antagonism, yes, maintains homeostasis, that we have the right nutrients, enough oxygen, to get us through stressful environments, but also try to conserve energy when we're at rest. So, and I'm like, you're parasympathetic. This is when you're at rest. This promotes maintenance activities and tries to conserve as much body energy as possible. And I'm like, so we're just trying to, digest our food, to get the nutrients out of it. The diuresis, we're making urine, we're filtering our blood, we're getting rid of our waste products through defecation. And I'm like, we're just trying to maintain our body as is at rest. Now, this, at rest, yes, your blood pressure's low, your heart rate's low, your respiratory rates are low. It's also when you're digesting food. And I'm like, your pupils are constricted, they're small, they don't need to be big. You're accommodated for close vision, you're not trying to see anything high distance, you're just relaxed. And I'm like, that's all your parasympathetic. Your sympathetic is when you're under stress. And I'm like, it prepares your body for this fight or flight system. Whether it's running from a bear or you're stressed out because you walked into the room and they're like, there's a test today. And you're like, what? And I'm like, it's preparing yourself for a stressful environment. And I'm like, whether this is, some type of exercise can stress your body, excitement about something, scared, there's an emergency, embarrassment, whatever. And I'm like, things that happen in any of these situations, one, your heartbeat starts to beat faster, your mouth starts to dry, your skin starts to sweat, your pupils dilate, they get larger, you can get more light and see better. Your cells are undergoing metabolism faster. They're breaking down sugar, trying to make as much ATP as possible. You have more blood glucose levels, mostly because your cells need it, and I'm like, to make the ATP. And we're mobilizing fats. We're breaking down fats to be used as fuel, because if you have to run from a bear or whatever it is, you need the fuel. Your body, your muscles, they all need that energy really quick, really fast, right there, ready to go. Now, during vigorous physical activity, if you're like, I'm going to run a marathon or whatever, and I'm like, our body does try to shunt as much blood to our skeletal muscles and to our heart. Also, it will start to dilate your bronchioles. Now, why do you think that's good? First, where do you find bronchioles? In your lungs. Why would we want to dilate them? Get more oxygen in. If you've got some type of physical activity, if you're just running or sprinting, whatever it is, your bronchioles will dilate. Again, we want to try to get as much oxygen in as possible. And it will cause our liver to release glucose. Our liver can store glucose. Now, we've got all these nerves that, yes, might control different parts of our body coming off our spinal cord. But we have parasympathetic nerves and we have sympathetic nerves. Now, coming off, this is when you're at rest. And I'm like, and you can see I'm like, at rest, I'm like, so this is just maintaining everything. And I'm like, we have lots of restful parasympathetic, at rest things that are coming off of way up there in the midbrain and way down here in the sacral region that are controlling all of these, all the blue. These are our parasympathetic, restful things that are getting controlled. If you are under stress, and I'm like, some of these exact same organs, like your stomach and your pancreas and your lungs and your heart, they are getting controlled by other nerves. And so your heart, if you're under stress, your heart increases. It's controlled by nerves coming from the thoracic region. At rest, Your heart, when it says let's slow down because we're at rest, we don't have to beat as fast, it actually is coming from information from your the medulla oblongata, up there in your midbrain. And I'm like, not midbrain, but I'm like, up there in the brainstem. And I'm like, so there's different parts of the spinal cord that are controlling same organs, just at rest versus non-rest. Different picture showing same thing, don't care. Same thing, rest versus non-rest. Now, as I said, most visceral organs, not all, have the dual innervation. The antagonism allows us to maintain homeostasis. We have precise control of all our visceral activities. You know, one thing increases heart and respiratory rates. The other thing decreases heart and respiratory rates when you're at stress. An interesting part, too, when you're at stress, your digestion is inhibited. I'm like, if you just saw a bear, digesting your lunch that day is not a top priority. And I'm like, this is one of those things, too. I'm like, if you go somewhere and someone was just in a car accident, you know, and they're in surgery or whatever, and I'm like, everyone, you know, so you're waiting, you're so stressed out, you're like, so-and-so's in the car, I'm waiting, oh my God, they're in surgery, blah, 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 blah. Are you hungry when you're super stressed out? No, but what does everyone want to do? Feed you. And I'm like, when you're under stress, eating is the absolute last thing that you want to do. And I'm like, that's your nervous system inhibiting digestion. And I'm like, so, and when someone's stressed out, don't keep trying to feed them. I mean, yes, they have to eat eventually, but I'm like, they're not hungry. This is like, you can take a look, that's in your book. It's on page 536. This is showing a whole bunch of different organs. You know, I'm like, what happens when the parasympathetic nervous system is in action? And I'm like, versus the sympathetic. You know, just an example of the lungs, because it's low on here. And I'm like, when you're at rest, your bronchioles are small and constricted. When you're stressed out, they dilate, get bigger, so you can get more oxygen in. Again, as I said before, some things have no effect. And I'm like, there's no, you know, make less sweat for sweat glands, but when you're under stress, you can make more sweat. A whole bunch of them, 2 slides of them. Now, what controls all of this? The main controller of our autonomic nervous system is our hypothalamus. So that thing below the thalamus in our brain. It's the main one that controls all of our autonomic nervous system. It has the most direct influence. There are some other controls from your cerebral cortex, the outside of your brain, part of the reticular formation, not going to get into that part of it, and some spinal cord. But the majority of all of these things that you don't have control over is generally your hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus control might be direct or indirect. And I'm like, things that the hypothalamus can control, it can control your heart activity, your blood pressure, your body temperature, your water balance. It can tell you if you're thirsty or not. Your endocrine activity, various hormones. It can control your emotional stages, whether you're happy or you're mad. Various biological drives, whether you're hungry, whether you're thirsty. This is your sex drive. That's all hypothalamus. Also your reactions to fear and your fight or flight system. And I'm like, so, you know, do people like to be scared? And that's why they go to movie theaters, things, you know, scary movies. And I'm like, the hypothalamus seems to like that. And I'm like, and how you react in these fight or flights. Are you the fight or are you the flight? It's all hypothalamus controlled. This is just showing, I'm like, yes, here's your hypothalamus. It is the boss of the autonomic nervous system. Yes, there's a few other ways that it can send information back and forth. Some of this, I'm like, I can't remember how much detail I go into it. Some of this, I think, was in chapter 12. Like, what does the cerebral cortex do? But the limbic system, a little interesting part, it is the emotional input. It's the emotional part of your brain is the limbic system. I don't go into much detail. But the hypothalamus really, it's the one that's going to send information to different parts of the brain or different parts of the central nervous system. So it's controlling, you know, whether your heartbeat is going to go up, whether it's not, and it will have to send information down to the brainstem, down to the spinal cord, out to the nerves that control various body things. But what's originally going to say your heart rate needs to go up, or you need to start increasing breathing, whatever it is, it's all hypothalamus, boss of the autonomic nervous system. And I did get to my Asian sucks, and this is why. Well, I didn't even talk about the old people driving. Things that can happen with just autonomic nervous system as you get older. One, constipation. And I'm like, mostly because I'm like, you have nerves that are controlling your intestinal tract that's telling the muscles to contract in your intestines and move food through. As you get older, those nerves get a little sluggish. They don't tell the muscles to contract anymore. Everything slows down, leads to constipation. Dry eyes. We have nerves that tell our eyes, our lacrimal glands, to make tears and to contract, wet the eyes. That slows down as well. We also can develop something known as orthostatic hypotension. You may have already experienced this already. You're getting old. It means you get a really low blood pressure after a position change. How many of you have been like sitting somewhere or squatting and then you stand up really fast and you get dizzy? Orthostatic hypotension. As a little kid, you probably never had that, and all of a sudden you're like, what just happened? It's a low blood pressure after a position change. You just change your position, and I'm like, and there are pressure receptors in your blood vessels that aren't getting the information quite fast enough on where we're not moving blood and in what direction, and so you can have low blood pressure, and I'm like, and you kind of get that lightheaded. Yes, it should equalize. You're healthy enough, you're fine. If you've got other cardiovascular problems, it can cause problems, but otherwise, you're fine. Yay. My last review then, last review questions. We got through it all, sweet. A synonym, meaning another word, for the autonomic nervous system, which reflects its major function, would be what? It is the yellow, the involuntary, because yes, you don't have control over the autonomic, it's automatic. Regulation of heart rate at low, normal levels is achieved by what? Oh, my green was supposed to be and pink or orange, but oh well. So heart rate at low, normal levels. It's not green. Low, normal levels is parasympathetic. It means you're resting. That's the low level. All right, it's really long. In general, your sympathetic innervation. So this is under stress. So the stressful innervation of visceral organs, internal organs, via the lumbar and sacral nerves, I don't care about the word in the middle, inhibits the activity of these organs. Why? So when you're under stress, why is your internal visceral organs inhibited? It's a really long way of saying that. When you're under stress, why the internal visceral organs inhibited? It is the green, because when you're at stress, when you're at stress, that sympathetic stressful activity primes the body for physical activity and shuts down all non-critical body organs or activities like digestion. Which area of the body receives no innervation of the parasympathetic nervous system? I mentioned this one as my example. Which one has no restful information sent to it? It's the green, the sweat glands. There's no restful information that needs to get sent to the sweat glands. It's just, they don't do anything. The sympathetic division is involved in which of the following processes? It's all of them. When you're under stress, yes, we're going to, it regulates our blood pressure. It will go up. We're going to increase glucose metabolism, and I'm like, so that we've got glucose available for ourselves. And we're going to decrease urinary output because it's a non-critical function. And the last one, at the top of the autonomic nervous system hierarchy, the what controls most of the autonomic nervous system? It's who's the boss? Yes, the hypothalamus is what's really controlling that autonomic nervous system.